Jeff Jantz here at Jantzer Studios, and I'm here to tell you about a wagon I made for a special little story about a trip down the trail to Oregon. So if you've seen the play, The Trail to Oregon, then you already know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, well, I'll briefly explain it so you don't think that I'm completely crazy. But there's this really awesome play called The Trail to Oregon, and it's by Team Starkid. It was a really great play, and it has this wagon because, well, they're going down the trail to Oregon. The wagon in the original play, well, even though the play was great, their wagon, I guess we'll just say it left a little bit to the imagination. So when my friend Ryan Amon of RPG Comedy came to me and said, hey, we need a wagon for this play we're doing at Planet Ant this summer, well, that got my wheels spinning. And I designed and built a wagon. I think it's pretty cool. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. And I think you'll like it too. If you're thinking about building a wagon or doing this play, hopefully this will be helpful to you. And if not, well, hopefully you at least find the video interesting. The budget for this wagon was pretty tight, so I ended up rounding up a few wooden pallets, and I think that worked out pretty good because the wood is nice and worn already. So since this is supposed to be kind of a rickety wagon, that just worked to our advantage. I did end up buying this fancy pry bar that's specifically for tearing apart decks and wood pallets, and it worked out pretty good. It saved me some time, but it was still pretty time consuming. Pounding out all the nails also took a while, but we got it done. As a quick little bonus tip, if you're ever using a hammer that has a straight claw like this, it actually works a lot better if you pry the hammer sideways. A lot of people don't know that that's how this type of hammer is supposed to be used, but it actually works a lot better than the traditional curved claw hammer. That's a pretty decent lumber pile for free. So the first step is to build the structure or the frame of this thing. I kind of used a similar sort of design to how I might build a truss, with making sure that I have some angles in here to make sure that it's nice and strong. Once I laid it all out on the table and set it all together, then I tacked it in with a brad nailer and then screwed it together with some thicker screws just to make sure it doesn't come apart. And then I did the same thing for the other side. Then I set the two sides on the floor upside down and connected them across the front and the back with a kind of thicker piece of lumber. And I made sure that I was always drilling pilot holes into every piece because some of the lumber is a little bit old and dried out, and I wanted to make sure it wasn't going to split. I used some 2x6 that I had laying around to connect the bottom. I wanted to make sure that this part was pretty strong since this is what the casters are going to connect to. I think the casters were actually the most expensive part of this project. It was about 35 bucks for a set of 4. And I wanted to make sure I had good casters with ball bearings so that this thing would roll nice and smooth. I'm just clamping this piece on temporarily to hold these beams in place while I screw everything in. I'm still going to drill pilot holes in here and make sure that everything is nice and tight. Once I get both sides screwed in, I'll unclamp this, and then basically the frame part of this is done. Now it's time to create the rickety facade. This is mostly aesthetic, but it definitely is going to add some structure too. We're going to start with the deck, and a lot of this is just kind of sorting out and making sure that I have the pieces that really have the right look. Laying all of them out like this also gives me a chance to figure out the spacing. Then I cut them all to length and just cleaned them up a little bit. And since this isn't really a load-bearing part of the structure, I just tacked everything in with the brad nailer. By the way, that there is what they call a floor window. So the sides of this thing are really what the audience is going to see the most. So I wanted to really make sure they looked extra rickety and torn up. So I just used my battery-powered circular saw to add in a little bit of extra grit. I also laid out the sides similar to the way I did the top, but trying to make it look extra rickety and inconsistent. I wanted to make sure that it kind of looked like it was bowed down in the middle. So I actually bent this piece a little bit extra. Once I got it to this point, it was already pretty strong, but there's going to be like 5 people sitting on this thing. So I just wanted to make sure that it was extra sturdy. So I added a couple of braces. Anytime you're trying to make something stronger, it never hurts to add an X or a triangle. I don't think I'm really giving too much away if I tell you that at some point in the play, the family upgrades to a better wagon. And we didn't really have the space on our stage to have a whole separate wagon, so we decided to make a little facade that can just be easily placed on and taken off with a French cleat. So I used some of the nicer lumber that I had, and I used an old sheet of plywood and made this little panel that will go on there. I left this space open, which you'll see why in a little bit. Then I attached it to the French cleat, and it just comes right off of there, nice and easy. As I mentioned, we're using this wagon for multiple wagons. The first wagon that they have in the play has octagon wheels for 8 times the traction. I'm going to show you how I made the octagon wheels and the round wheels, but I also made another video that goes into a little bit more detail about how I made the round wheels, so make sure you check that out too. Now, I'm sure I could have figured out the sizes for the pieces I needed for these wheels by doing some fancy math, but I like to see what I'm doing, so this is what I call cardboard math. Once I figured out my sizes, I ripped some lumber to the size that I needed, and then I cut them to length. I set the stop on my saw so that way I could cut everything to the right size without having to measure each piece. There are 16 of these pieces for the round wheels and 32 of these pieces for the octagon wheels. Both types of wheels started out as an octagon, but the round ones are just a little bit thicker because some of it's going to get cut off. To clamp them together, I just glued them and used one of these tie-down straps to kind of hold everything in place until it dried. I just kind of slapped the spokes and the hub in on the octagon wheels because it's supposed to look rickety. But for the round wheels, I wanted to make sure that I had a nice round hub, so I used my hole saw and my drill press. Then I attached the wood to the drill press and sanded it really good. Then I sanded the wood on the inside and out, and then attached the spokes very carefully and tried to make sure they were precise. This is one of my favorite little tricks for cutting circles using a table saw. Basically, you just use this jig and kind of slide it back and forth. I go into this a little bit more in depth in the other video, so you'll have to check that out if it's something you're interested in, but it works pretty good. To attach the wheels, I simply bolt the threaded rod to each corner of the wagon, and then cut it to length. I wanted the wheels to be able to spin freely, so I made some bushings with aluminum tubing. I also made some spacers with that same aluminum tubing, stuck it all on with some bearing grease, stuck on the wheels, and then bolted them on with one nylock so that it wouldn't come loose too easily. And we're rolling! Now we gotta add just a little bit of color. I already had this water-based clear coat, so I decided to make my own stain using some acrylic paint and that. I'm using this stain for the pieces that are going to be part of the panel for the nicer wagon. I'm kind of going for like a woody hot rod kind of look. I'm also going to use this darker red cherry stain, and I think it's going to be a nice little combination. So I'm just adjusting and clamping all these trim pieces to the panel, then I'm going to flip it over and nail it to the back. I'll also throw in a couple screws just to make sure everything is tight.
Oh yeah.
I want the main part of the wagon to look really weather beaten and worn, so I'm just going to roll this outside because this part's going to get a little bit messy. But basically I'm just using some black, brown, and white paint. And I'm just going to kind of wipe it on, brush it on, wipe it off, wash it off, work it in, and just make it work. Just want to make it look as grungy as I can. This part of the project took pretty much like a whole afternoon, but I think it turned out pretty good. For the 3 arches on the wagon, I'm going to use this PVC trim. It's white, so I'm just going to wipe on some brown paint really quick, kind of like stain, to give it more of a wood look. This stuff is great because it's really flexible and it's not really going to break when I screw it onto both sides, but it's also going to kind of wiggle around a little bit, which I think will be a good little aesthetic. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. I really enjoyed making this project, and it was really awesome to see the wagon being used in the play. The performance was amazing, the play was great, and the great news is that RPG Comedy is going to be doing another Starkid play next summer. So I'm going to be starting to work on some of those props and also puppets, and we'll be showing you how we're going to build a lot of those things. So stay tuned, make sure you like and subscribe.